On the 16th of October, 1817, a former circus strongman from Padua named Giovanni Battista Belzoni stood at the entrance to a hole in the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings and stared into a darkness that no human eyes had penetrated for more than 3,000 years. Belzoni, a remarkable figure in the history of Egyptology, a man whose extraordinary physical strength, adventurous spirit, and genuine intellectual curiosity combined to make him one of the most effective, most physically formidable, and most colourful explorers and antiquarians of the early 19th century, had discovered the tomb just days after finding the burial of Ramesses I, Seti's father, in a nearby tomb designated KV-16. But the tomb that now opened before him was something else entirely. The entrance led downward, steeply, deeply, inexorably, and relentlessly downward, through a series of corridors and chambers that descended more than 30 meters beneath the surface of the desert, extending for more than 100 meters into the bedrock of the Theban hills. And every surface, every wall, every ceiling, every pillar, every corridor was covered in paintings and carved reliefs of a quality and a beauty that Belzoni had never seen before and that he would never see again. The colours were still vivid, blues and golds and reds and greens that looked, in the flickering light of Belzoni's torches, as though they had been painted that morning, rather than 32 centuries earlier. The figures of gods and goddesses moved across the walls in processions of divine majesty. Osiris receiving the dead Pharaoh in the underworld, Anubis guiding the soul through the darkness, Hathor welcoming the king into the realm of the blessed. The ceiling of the burial chamber was painted with an astronomical chart, a breathtaking map of the heavens, rendered in rich, luminous deep blue and shimmering gold, showing the constellations and the decans and the figures of the celestial deities that governed the passage of the night sky. The detail was extraordinary. Every individual feather on every divine wing, every delicate scale on every protective serpent, every hieroglyphic sign was carved with a precision and a delicacy that spoke of artisans who had spent years in the darkness of this tomb, working by lamplight, creating what would become the single most beautiful, most artistically accomplished, and most theologically comprehensive royal burial in the entire history of the Valley of the Kings. When Belzoni emerged from the tomb, he was shaken, not by fear but by awe. He had spent years in Egypt, excavating tombs and temples, transporting colossal statues and opening sealed burial chambers. He had seen the great state temples of Luxor and Karnak, monuments whose scale and whose artistry had impressed every traveller who had encountered them. He had explored the tombs of the 18th Dynasty pharaohs. He had moved the colossal bust of Ramesses II from the Ramesseum to the banks of the Nile for shipment to London. But nothing in his considerable experience had prepared him for what he had seen in the depths of this tomb. The quality of the art was beyond anything he had encountered. The comprehensiveness of the decoration was unprecedented. The preservation of the colours was extraordinary, and the sheer scale of the tomb, corridor after corridor, chamber after chamber, descending deeper and deeper into the rock, every surface covered in images of gods and pharaohs and sacred texts, was overwhelming. The moment of discovery, the instant when Belzoni's lamplight first fell on the painted walls of KV-17 and the colours of the reliefs blazed to life in the darkness, is one of the great moments in the history of archaeology, a moment when the modern world encountered the vanished ancient world with a shocking directness and an immediacy that few subsequent discoveries have equalled. The tomb had been sealed for more than 3,000 years. No human eyes had seen the paintings since the day the burial was completed, and the entrance was covered with rubble and sand. The colours were pristine, untouched by the fading effects of light, undimmed by the degradation of exposure, as vivid and as fresh as the day the painters had applied them. The experience must have been overwhelming, a descent into a breathtaking subterranean world of sacred beauty and divine majesty that seemed to exist entirely outside of time, a world in which the sacred art of the 13th century BC was as vivid and as alive and as immediate as the art of the 19th century, a world in which the immense distance between the ancient world and the modern world collapsed entirely, and the visitor found himself face to face with the creative genius of a civilization that had vanished from the earth more than 2 millennia before his birth. Belzoni would later describe his discovery in a published account that became one of the most widely read, most enthusiastically received, and most culturally influential travel narratives of the early 19th century. An account that contributed to the wave of fascination with ancient Egypt that swept across Europe in the decades following Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. The account was vivid, detailed, and marked by a genuine sense of wonder. The wonder of a man who understood that he had found something extraordinary, something that surpassed not merely the other tombs he had explored, but anything that had ever been created in the sacred and theologically imperative service of the royal dead. The tomb was KV-17. The pharaoh was Seti I, the second king of the 19th Dynasty, the son of Ramesses I, the father of Ramesses II, the military commander who had restored Egyptian power in the Levant after decades of decline, the builder of the magnificent temple at Abydos, the pharaoh who commissioned and began the construction of the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, one of the most awe-inspiring architectural spaces ever created by human hands, and the man whose tomb, this extraordinary tomb, this 137-meter-long descent into the symbolic darkness of the underworld, represents the single greatest achievement of funerary art in the 3,000-year history of the pharaonic state. Belzoni called it the finest tomb of all the pharaohs. Modern scholars have echoed the judgment, describing KV-17 as the most perfectly decorated, the most completely finished, and the most artistically accomplished royal tomb in the entire Valley of the Kings. The tomb was the very first royal tomb in the entire Valley of the Kings to be entirely, completely, and comprehensively decorated on every available surface, every chamber, every corridor, every surface covered in painted relief of the highest quality. No earlier tomb had attempted this level of comprehensive decoration, and no later tomb would match it. The quality of the art in KV-17 is not merely a matter of technical accomplishment, it is a matter of vision, of intention, of the deliberate decision to create something that would be not merely adequate but unsurpassable. The artisans of Deir el-Medina, the specialized community of craftsmen who lived in the purpose-built village near the Valley of the Kings, and who devoted their working lives to the creation of the royal tombs, had been producing funerary art of high quality for centuries. But in KV-17, something changed. The level of ambition increased, the resources available to the artisans expanded, the expectations of the pharaoh grew, and the result was a tomb that stands, by the unanimous judgment of the scholars who have studied it, at the absolute summit of the tradition. A work of art that was not merely the best tomb of its era, but the best tomb that the tradition would ever produce. KV-17 is, in the estimation of the scholars who have studied it, the pinnacle, the absolute zenith of the ancient Egyptian funerary art tradition, the moment when the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina reached the apex of their skill and produced a masterpiece that would never be surpassed. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Seti I was. Not merely the father of Ramesses the Great, not merely the pharaoh with the beautiful tomb, but the specific, complex, artistically visionary, and historically consequential man who inherited a kingdom that had been weakened by decades of theological upheaval and political instability, and who transformed it through military brilliance, administrative competence, and an artistic vision of extraordinary ambition into the most militarily powerful, most institutionally stable, and most culturally sophisticated state in the entire ancient world. You are going to understand what happened to his tomb, how the most beautiful burial in the ancient world was progressively damaged and stripped by the very scholars and explorers who came to admire it, how the sarcophagus was shipped to London, how the wall panels were scattered across the museums of Europe, and how the tomb that Belzoni had found on that extraordinary October day in 1817 in near-perfect, almost miraculously pristine condition has been progressively, systematically, and heartbreakingly reduced to a fragmented, scattered, and significantly diminished version of what it once was. A version that, while still beautiful, while still awe-inspiring, while still capable of moving the sensitive observer to tears, is no longer the complete, unified, comprehensively decorated masterpiece that the artisans of Deir el-Medina created and that Belzoni saw when he first descended into the darkness on that October afternoon in 1817. And you are going to understand why his tomb is not merely beautiful but significant. Why the art that covers its walls represents not merely aesthetic achievement but theological statement, not merely decoration but declaration, not merely the work of craftsmen but the material expression of a pharaoh's comprehensive vision of his own eternity, his own divinity, and his own place in the cosmic order that governed the relationship between the world of the living and the world of the dead. You are going to understand the tomb not as a static monument, a beautiful relic of a vanished civilization, but as a dynamic, functioning, theologically purposeful space that was designed to accomplish the most ambitious goal that the human imagination has ever conceived: the permanent defeat of death and the eternal survival of the individual soul in a universe of divine order and cosmic beauty and his own place in the cosmic order. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The story begins in the darkness, in the long, painted corridors of a tomb that descends 137 meters into the earth, in the flickering light of a lamp held by a man from Padua who was the first human being in more than 3,000 years to witness and to behold the sacred wonders that lay within. Now, let us begin the journey together. The man who would create the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings was born into a military family in the Nile Delta region sometime in the early 13th century BC. His father was Ramesses, a career soldier, a decorated military commander, a former vizier, a man who had served under Horemheb as the last pharaoh of the 18th Dynasty, and who had been chosen by the childless Horemheb as his successor. The choice was pragmatic. Horemheb needed a successor with a family, a man who could provide the dynastic continuity that Horemheb's own childlessness could not, and Ramesses had what Horemheb lacked: a son. That son was Seti. The name Seti, or more precisely, Seti, means of Seth, indicating that the young prince was consecrated to the god Seth, the ancient deity of chaos, storms, and the desert. The choice of Seth as the patron deity of a royal prince was significant. Seth was a controversial figure in the Egyptian pantheon, associated with both destructive power and protective strength, and the consecration of a prince to Seth suggested a family that was comfortable with the more martial and more aggressive aspects of Egyptian theology. The name was a declaration of military identity, a deliberate and culturally significant statement that the boy who bore this distinctive name was destined for the battlefield rather than the temple, for the exercise of power rather than the contemplation of the divine. Seti's early career was shaped by his father's position at the pinnacle of the Egyptian military establishment. During the reign of Horemheb, the young and increasingly prominent Seti held a distinguished collection of important titles that reflected both military and administrative authority: troop commander, vizier, head archer, and other designations that placed him at the center of the Egyptian state's military and bureaucratic apparatus. The young Seti was, by all accounts, a capable and energetic military officer, a man whose remarkable combination of physical courage, tactical intelligence, strategic vision, and administrative competence had earned him the respect of the army and the attention of the pharaoh. The reliefs in his later tomb and temples would depict him as a warrior of extraordinary prowess, driving his chariot into the heart of the enemy formations, wielding his bow with deadly accuracy, trampling the defeated beneath his horse's hooves. The depictions are conventional, they follow the standard formulas of Egyptian military art, but the military campaigns they commemorate were real, and the successes they celebrate were genuine achievements that restored Egyptian authority in territories that had been lost or weakened during the chaos of the preceding decades. When Horemheb died and Ramesses I ascended the throne, becoming the founder of the 19th Dynasty and the first of the Ramesside pharaohs, Seti was immediately designated as the crown, prince and co-regent, ensuring that the succession would be smooth, the transition would be orderly, and the dynastic continuity that Horemheb had so carefully arranged and that the Egyptian state so urgently required would be maintained without interruption or challenge. The co-regency between Seti and his father Ramesses I, however brief it may have been, established a pattern that Seti would later replicate with his own son, the future Ramesses II. The practice of co-regency, in which the reigning pharaoh designated his chosen successor and shared the throne with him for a period of time before the elder pharaoh's death, was a mechanism of political insurance, a way of ensuring that the succession would be orderly and that the designated heir would have the experience, the visibility, and the institutional authority needed to assume the throne without the kind of devastating and politically destabilizing succession crisis that had plagued the late 18th dynasty. Seti understood, from his own personal experience, the considerable practical and political value of this dynastic mechanism. He had benefited from it himself, and he applied it to his own succession, designating the young Ramesses as co-regent and crown prince, and bringing him into the active, visible, and increasingly responsible exercise of royal authority from a remarkably early age, ensuring that the transition between father and son would be smooth, orderly, and constitutionally legitimate. The reign of Ramesses I was brief, barely 2 years, from approximately 1292 to 1290 BC. The old soldier died before he could accomplish much as pharaoh. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV-16, was small and only partially decorated, reflecting the brevity of his reign, the advanced age at which he had ascended the throne, and the haste with which his burial was prepared by the priests and the officials who managed the transition from the 18th to the 19th dynasty. But the brevity of Ramesses I's reign was not a failure. It was a bridge, a transition from the 18th dynasty to the 19th, from the era of Horemheb's restoration to the era of Ramesside expansion. The bridge was short because it did not need to be long. Its purpose was not to carry the traffic of a full reign, but merely to span the politically precarious gap between one dying dynasty and the next emerging one, between one generation and the next, between the childless general who had ended the 18th dynasty and the young, energetic, and militarily gifted commander who would inaugurate the magnificent golden age of the 19th. Seti inherited a kingdom that was, by virtually any external or institutional measure, in better shape than it had been for decades. Horemheb's comprehensive and historically significant reforms had restored the fundamental institutional structures of the Egyptian state. The temples of Amun had been reopened and refunded, the judicial system had been reformed, and the administrative apparatus had been restructured. The 19th dynasty was, at the moment of Seti's accession, only one generation old. A dynasty founded not by a prince of the blood, but by a military official, a commoner, a man who had been chosen for the throne by another commoner. The dynasty's legitimacy was not established by birth or by tradition, but by appointment and by competence. And the competence needed to be demonstrated, visibly, dramatically, and with the kind of overwhelming artistic and military evidence that would leave no room for doubt, no space for challenge, and no opportunity for the enemies of the dynasty to question the legitimacy of the men who sat on the throne. Seti understood this with an instinctive clarity that went beyond mere political calculation. He understood that the dynasty's long-term survival and ultimate historical success depended not merely on the routine exercise of political and military power, but on the demonstration of power, not merely on the achievement of military victories, but on the commemoration of those victories in monuments of such scale and such beauty that they would silence the critics and establish, beyond any possibility of dispute, the divine right of the Ramesside pharaohs to rule. Seti understood this with the clarity of a man who had been raised in the political culture of the Egyptian military establishment. If the young and still untested dynasty was to survive, to consolidate its authority, and to thrive in the competitive and dangerous environment of the ancient Near Eastern world, Seti understood this with the clarity of a man who had been raised in the political culture of the Egyptian military establishment, a culture that valued results over rhetoric, achievement over ancestry, and the visible, demonstrable, and publicly verifiable exercise of power over the invisible and inherently more fragile claim of ancestral lineage. But the external stability masked internal weaknesses that Seti would need to address. The military situation in the Levant, the strategic corridor that connected Egypt to the trade routes of Mesopotamia and Anatolia, had deteriorated significantly during the Amarna period and had only partially been restored under Horemheb. The Hittite Empire, the great power of Anatolia, the empire of Hattusa and Carchemish, and the warrior kings who controlled the trade routes of northern Mesopotamia and the strategic passes of the Taurus Mountains, was Egypt's principal rival for control of the ancient Near East, had expanded aggressively during the decades of Egyptian inattention, seizing the strategic city of Kadesh and the territory of Amurru, and establishing a sphere of influence that extended deep into territories that Egypt had traditionally claimed. The roads were unsafe, the tribute had stopped flowing. The Shasu Bedouins, nomadic peoples of the Sinai and the Negev, had seized the wells and the forts along the coastal road that connected Egypt to Gaza, disrupting the vital supply lines and logistical corridors that the entire Egyptian military establishment depended upon for the effective projection of power and influence into the Levant. The challenge that Seti faced upon his accession was not merely military, it was existential. The 19th Dynasty needed to prove itself, to demonstrate to Egypt, to the surrounding powers, and to the gods that the Ramesses pharaohs were worthy of the throne they had been given, that the dynasty was not a temporary arrangement but a permanent institution, and that the men who bore the name of Ramesses possessed the military, administrative, and theological competence that the pharaonic system demanded. The proving ground was the battlefield, the place where the dynasty's claims would be tested against the reality of enemy armies, hostile terrain, and the unforgiving calculus of military logistics and tactical execution. Seti did not sit in the palace, he marched. His first campaign, launched in the first year of his reign, was practical rather than glorious. He needed to reopen the supply lines. He marched his army along the ways of Horus, the ancient, well-established, and strategically indispensable military road that followed the Mediterranean coastline from the eastern delta to the fortress town of Gaza, clearing the wells, the watchtowers, and the fortified stations that the Shasu nomads had seized during the years of Egyptian weakness, garrisoning each position with loyal troops and re-establishing the system of communications and supply that linked the Egyptian delta to the frontier fortress of Gaza, and that served as the logistical backbone of any military operation in the Levant. The campaign was methodical rather than dramatic, a series of small but tactically significant engagements, strategically placed garrison deployments, and essential infrastructure restorations that lacked the theatrical glory of a great battle, but that accomplished the essential strategic objective of making the roads safe for the passage of armies and the transportation of supplies, and re-establishing the infrastructure of military communication and supply. That was the precondition for any larger campaign. The scenes of this first campaign are carved on the north exterior wall of the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, monumental reliefs showing Seti driving his chariot into battle, trampling the enemy beneath his horse's hooves, and receiving the submission of the defeated peoples. The campaign along the ways of Horus was the first in a series of military operations that Seti would conduct throughout his reign. Operations that would take him and his army deep into the Levant, that would bring him into direct military conflict with the Hittite Empire, and that would restore Egyptian authority in territories that had been lost or weakened during the decades of the Amarna period and its aftermath. The campaigns were not defensive. They were aggressive, ambitious, and strategically calculated, the work of a commander who understood that the security of Egypt depended not merely on the defense of its borders, but on the projection of power into the surrounding territories, on the maintenance of a buffer zone of client states and vassal kingdoms that would absorb the impact of any potential invasion. and that would ensure the continued flow of tribute and trade goods that the Egyptian economy, the Egyptian religious establishment, and the Egyptian luxury goods trade all critically depended upon. The scenes are not merely propaganda. They are a visual record of a military operation that was necessary, practical, and strategically sound, the systematic, strategically planned work of a professional military commander who understood with complete clarity that the effective and sustained projection of Egyptian power and influence into the Levant required not the dramatic heroism of a single great battle, but the methodical, unglamorous work of securing supply lines, garrisoning fortresses, and maintaining the infrastructure of military communication. With the coastal road reopened, Seti pushed north, into Canaan, into Lebanon, into Syria. He received tribute from some cities and conquered others. He subdued the heavily fortified fortress of Beth Shan in the Jezreel Valley and the strategically important town of Yanoam, demonstrating the reach and the effectiveness of the Egyptian military machine under his personal command. He engaged the Hittites in battle at Kadesh, the strategically vital city on the Orontes River that controlled access to the interior of Syria, and he captured it. The campaign against the Hittites was the most consequential military operation of Seti's reign, and one of the most significant military operations of the entire 19th Dynasty. The Hittite Empire, under the leadership of the warrior king Muwatalli II, had expanded its sphere of influence deep into northern Syria, establishing control over the strategic cities and the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean coast to the interior of Mesopotamia. The Hittite expansion had occurred largely during the decades of Egyptian neglect that characterized the Amarna period, decades during which Akhenaten's theological preoccupations had led him to ignore the increasingly desperate pleas of Egypt's Levantine allies, and during which the Hittites had systematically absorbed the territories that Egypt's attention had abandoned. Seti's response to the Hittite expansion was direct, aggressive, and militarily effective. He marched his army north from Egypt through the coastal corridor, securing the cities of Canaan and Lebanon as he advanced, receiving the submission of local rulers who preferred Egyptian overlordship to Hittite domination. He then struck inland toward the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River, the strategic keystone of the Levantine corridor, the city whose control determined the balance of power between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. The Egyptian army, under Seti's personal command, engaged the Hittite forces defending the city and defeated them, driving them from the field and entering Kadesh in triumph. Seti's son Ramesses, the future Ramesses the Great, still a young prince at this point in his career, was present at the battle and participated in the victory. The capture of Kadesh was one of the most strategically significant and most historically consequential military achievements of Seti's entire reign. No Egyptian pharaoh had controlled the city since the reign of Akhenaten more than a generation earlier, and its recapture represented a dramatic reassertion of Egyptian authority in a region that the Hittites had claimed as their own. Seti erected a victory stela at the conquered city, a monumental stone monument inscribed with hieroglyphic texts celebrating the pharaoh's triumph, planted in the earth of the conquered territory as a permanent and visible declaration that the land belonged to Egypt, and that the power of the pharaoh extended to the banks of the Orontes River and beyond. The victory stela was not merely a commemoration, it was a claim, a legal and theological assertion of sovereignty that established the pharaoh's authority over the conquered territory, and that warned potential challengers that the Egyptian army, under the command of the warrior pharaoh, was capable of projecting force deep into the heart of the Levant and of defeating any army that stood in its way. A monument that commemorated the triumph and that declared, in the language of pharaonic propaganda, that the power of Egypt had been restored to its ancient extent. The Hittite reaction to Seti's victory at Kadesh was swift and forceful. The Hittite king Muwatalli II understood that the loss of Kadesh threatened the entire Hittite position in northern Syria, and he mobilized the resources of his empire to ensure that the city would be recovered. The diplomatic and military maneuvering that followed Seti's initial victory was complex and protracted, involving negotiations, troop movements, proxy conflicts, and the kind of strategic calculation that characterized the great power rivalry between Egypt and the Hittite Empire throughout the 13th century BC. The exact course of events is difficult to reconstruct from the surviving evidence. The Egyptian sources present every engagement as a triumph, while the Hittite sources are fragmentary and often contradictory, but the outcome is clear. Kadesh eventually returned to Hittite control, and the strategic situation in northern Syria reverted to the status quo ante. But the triumph at Kadesh was not permanent. The Hittites were too powerful, too determined, and too strategically positioned to be permanently displaced from northern Syria by a single campaign. Seti's victory was real. He had captured the city, he had defeated the Hittite army in the field, and he had erected his victory stela in the conquered territory. But the victory was not decisive. The Hittites would retake Kadesh, and Seti's son Ramesses would fight the famous Battle of Kadesh a generation later, a battle that would end in a stalemate rather than a victory, and that would eventually lead to the first known peace treaty in the history of the world. The military campaigns of Seti I are depicted in some of the most impressive military reliefs in the history of Egyptian art. Carved on the north exterior wall of the Great Hypostyle Hall at Karnak in scenes of extraordinary scale and dramatic intensity, the reliefs show the pharaoh in combat, charging into battle in his chariot, his bow drawn, his horses at full gallop, the enemy falling before him in attitudes of terror and defeat. The scenes are accompanied by hieroglyphic texts that identify the locations, the enemies, and the outcomes of the campaigns, providing a detailed, if inevitably propagandistic, record of the military operations that Seti conducted during his reign. The relief depicting the battle against the Hittites at Kadesh is particularly notable. It shows Seti personally engaging the Hittite warriors, his chariot plunging into the enemy ranks, the Hittite soldiers falling in attitudes of terror and defeat beneath the crushing wheels and the thundering hooves of the Egyptian war horses. The accompanying text describes the pharaoh's magnificent triumph in the traditional and theologically resonant language of divine conquest. The wretched land of the Hittites, among whom his majesty made a great slaughter. The language is conventional, the images are formulaic, but the military achievement they commemorate was real and consequential, a reassertion of Egyptian power in a region that had been conceded to the Hittites for a generation. The pattern was characteristic of Seti's military career. The pharaoh was a genuinely gifted tactician, a personally courageous and physically brave commander, a successful and respected warrior whose presence on the battlefield inspired the loyalty and the confidence of his troops. But the strategic reality of the ancient Near East, the delicate and constantly shifting balance of military and diplomatic power between the two great empires of Egypt and the Hittites, the considerable and ultimately insurmountable difficulty of maintaining effective long-term control over distant and strategically contested territories, the limitations of Egyptian logistical capacity, meant that his victories, however impressive, could not fundamentally alter the geopolitical landscape. The relationship between Seti and his son Ramesses, the relationship between the artistically gifted pharaoh who created and commissioned the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings and the pharaoh who had become the most famous ruler in the history of ancient Egypt, was one of the most consequential father-son relationships in the ancient world. Seti took his young son on military campaigns from an early age, training him in the arts of warfare, command, and leadership that would prepare him for the throne. The young Ramesses accompanied his father to Libya at approximately the age of 14, and he later accompanied him to Syria for the campaign against the Hittites at Kadesh. The training was deliberate. Seti was preparing his son not merely to succeed him, but to surpass him, to build on the foundations that Seti had laid, and to complete the work that Seti's early death would leave unfinished. The relationship between the two men, the father who built the most beautiful and the son who would build the most colossal, is one of the great father-son stories of the ancient world, a story of preparation, transmission, and legacy that spans the critically important transition from one generation of leadership to the next, and that produced, in the combined reigns of father and son, one of the most extraordinary periods of achievement in the long and endlessly fascinating history of human civilization. The military campaigns of Seti I were not limited to the Levant. He also conducted operations against the Libyan tribes who threatened Egypt's western border, a threat that would grow significantly under his successors and that would eventually produce a full-scale invasion during the reign of Ramesses III, and he suppressed a minor rebellion in Nubia, the resource-rich territory to the south that provided Egypt with gold, ivory, and other luxury goods. The Libyan campaigns were defensive rather than offensive, responding to raids and incursions rather than attempting to expand Egyptian territory to the west. But the campaigns were important because they demonstrated that the Egyptian military, under Seti's command, was capable of projecting power in multiple directions simultaneously, fighting in the Levant to the northeast, in Libya to the west, and in Nubia to the south, maintaining the security of the Egyptian state on all of its frontiers and deterring potential aggressors from taking advantage of perceived weakness. The Nubian campaign, carried out in Seti's 8th year, may have been led not by the pharaoh himself, but by his crown prince, the young Ramesses, the future Ramesses the Great, who was being systematically and deliberately trained in the arts of warfare, military command, diplomatic negotiation, and royal governance by accompanying his father on military campaigns from the age of approximately 14. The military achievements of Seti I are impressive, but they are not the reason that the pharaoh is remembered. Seti is remembered for what he built, and above all, for the tomb that he built for himself in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb that Belzoni discovered on that October day in 1817, the tomb that generation after generation of scholars, archaeologists, and visitors have unanimously called the most beautiful, the most comprehensively decorated, and the most artistically accomplished royal burial in the entire 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt. The tomb, KV-17, is the longest tomb in the Valley of the Kings, extending for approximately 137 meters from its entrance to the deepest point of the burial complex. It descends more than 30 meters beneath the surface of the desert, following a gently sloping axis through a series of 7 principal corridors and halls, with subsidiary side chambers branching from the main route for ritual and storage purposes. The layout of KV-17 follows the standard Ramesside tomb plan that had been established by Horemheb's KV-57, a linear, axial design in which a series of descending corridors and successive chambers leads progressively deeper into the rock, symbolically reproducing the pharaoh's solitary and spiritually perilous descent into the dark and dangerous depths of the underworld. But KV-17 surpasses Horemheb's tomb in every dimension. It is longer, deeper, more comprehensively decorated, and more architecturally ambitious. The tomb includes 11 chambers and side rooms, each one designed for a specific ritual or storage function, each one decorated with scenes and texts appropriate to its theological purpose. The progression from the entrance to the burial chamber follows the journey of the sun through the underworld. From the first hour of the night, when the sun enters the western horizon and begins its long, perilous, and symbolically charged journey through the darkness, to the final hour, when the sun emerges from the eastern horizon and begins a new day. The tomb is a map of the underworld, a 3-dimensional, architecturally rendered representation of the journey that the dead pharaoh must make in order to achieve eternal life. The tomb was carved entirely from the solid, unyielding living rock of the Theban hillside by the extraordinarily skilled and highly specialized artisans of the royal tomb-building community of Deir el-Medina, an organized, institutionally supported village of up to 60 trained specialists including quarrymen, draftsmen, sculptors, painters, and carpenters who lived in a purpose-built village near the Valley of the Kings and who devoted their working lives to the arduous, painstaking, and technically demanding creation of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The decoration of KV-17 is what sets it apart from every other tomb in the valley, and what makes it, in the judgment of virtually every scholar who has studied it, the supreme achievement of ancient Egyptian funerary art. the single most accomplished and most comprehensively decorated royal tomb ever created in the 3,000-year history of the pharaonic state. The artisans who created it, the quarrymen who carved the chambers from the solid limestone, the draftsmen who laid out the preliminary drawings and compositional plans with exacting precision and meticulous attention to proportion, the sculptors who transformed the flat surfaces into carved reliefs of extraordinary delicacy, the painters who applied the polychrome pigments that brought the figures to life, were among the most skilled, the most technically accomplished, and the most artistically gifted craftsmen in the entire history of human civilization. And the sacred and theologically consequential work they produced in the absolute darkness of this buried tomb, working hour after painstaking hour, and day after laborious day, by nothing more than the flickering, unsteady, and smoke-producing light of oil lamps, breathing the close, hot, dust-laden air of an underground chamber, was the finest work of their kind that had ever been achieved, and that would ever be achieved again. The tomb was the first royal tomb in the entire Valley of the Kings to be entirely, comprehensively, and completely decorated from entrance to burial chamber, every corridor, every pillar, every surface covered in painted relief of the most exquisite quality. The artisans of Deir el-Medina, who created the decoration of KV-17, were the inheritors of a tradition of funerary art that stretched back centuries, a tradition that had developed through the tombs of the 18th Dynasty, and that had reached a new level of sophistication under Horemheb, whose KV-57 tomb had introduced the Book of Gates and the practice of painted relief to the Valley of the Kings. But the artisans of Seti's tomb went far beyond what had been achieved in Horemheb's tomb, pushing the technique of carved and painted relief to its absolute limit, achieving a level of detail, a precision of line, and a subtlety of modelling that had never been attempted before, and that would never be equalled again. The technique used, raised relief, in which the background stone was carefully and precisely cut away to leave the figures standing in elegant, three-dimensional relief above the surface of the wall, and the raised figures were then painted in vivid polychrome, was the most labour-intensive, the most technically demanding, and the most visually impressive of all the relief techniques available to the Egyptian artisans, and the extraordinary quality, the meticulous precision, and the artistic refinement of the carving and the painting in KV-17 represents the absolute pinnacle of the technique. The decorative program of the tomb draws upon virtually every major funerary text in the Egyptian repertoire. The walls contain scenes from the Book of Gates, the theologically innovative funerary text that the pharaoh Horemheb had first introduced in his own groundbreaking tomb, KV-57, and that described the journey of the sun god through the 12 hours of the night. They contain scenes from the Litany of Re, a magnificent and theologically complex text that identifies the sun god with no fewer than 75 different divine forms and manifestations, and that celebrates the divine nature of the pharaoh as an incarnation of the solar deity. They contain scenes from the Amduat, the book of what is in the underworld, the oldest, the most venerable, and the most extensively documented of the Egyptian funerary texts, which had been the standard decorative program of the 18th Dynasty royal tombs. They contain scenes from the Book of the Heavenly Cow, a remarkable and theologically significant text that narrates the mythological rebellion of humanity against the sun god and the creation of the afterlife as a separate realm for the dead. And they contain one of the most detailed and most beautifully rendered versions of the opening of the mouth ceremony, the ritual by which the deceased's senses were restored and his ability to eat, drink, and breathe in the afterlife was guaranteed. One of the most widely celebrated and most scientifically significant features of the tomb's decoration is the series of scenes depicting the opening of the mouth ceremony in the corridors leading down toward the burial chamber deep within the earth. These scenes, showing priests performing the sacred rituals that restored the deceased's senses and abilities, are considered among the finest representations of the ceremony ever produced in Egyptian art. The figures of the priests are rendered with extraordinary care and precision. Their gestures, their facial expressions, their ritual implements, all depicted with a fidelity to detail that suggests the artisans had either personally witnessed the ceremony being performed or had access to detailed descriptions and illustrations that guided their work. The scenes are not merely illustrations, they are performative, designed to function as magical surrogates for the actual ceremony, ensuring that the ritual would continue to be performed for the pharaoh's benefit for all of eternity, independent of the participation of living priests, a kind of eternal insurance policy against the possibility that the funerary cult might someday be abandoned, or that the priests who maintained it might someday fail to perform their duties. The tomb was designed to be self-sufficient, a closed system of theological protection that would continue to function even if the world outside the tomb changed, even if the dynasty that built it collapsed, even if the civilization that created it eventually fell silent. The comprehensiveness of the decoration was not merely artistic ambition, it was theological prudence, a recognition that eternity was a very long time and that the pharaoh's soul could not depend entirely on the goodwill and the competence of the living. The burial chamber of KV-17, the room that housed the alabaster sarcophagus and the pharaoh's carefully and elaborately mummified body, is the theological heart of the tomb and the space in which the artisan's skill reached its fullest and most impressive expression. The vaulted ceiling is painted with the astronomical chart of the northern sky, constellations rendered in deep blue and gold, against a background of lapis lazuli blue, the celestial figures of gods and sacred animals positioned according to their actual locations in the heavens. The walls show the pharaoh in the company of the gods of the underworld: Osiris, Anubis, Hathor, Horus, Isis, Nephthys, each one depicted with a clarity and a refinement of line that has led scholars to describe the burial chamber reliefs as the single most accomplished, most delicately carved, and most artistically refined examples of Egyptian funerary art ever produced in the entire history of the pharaonic tradition. The sarcophagus itself, the translucent alabaster coffin, glowing with an inner light when illuminated by the funerary lamps, was the sacred and theologically central focal point of the chamber, the container for the pharaoh's body, the vessel that would carry his physical remains through eternity, while his soul journeyed through the underworld and emerged, reborn, with the rising sun, even after the living priests who had performed the original ceremony had themselves died and been buried. The comprehensiveness of the decorative program is itself significant. It suggests that Seti intended his tomb to be a complete compendium of Egyptian funerary theology, a visual encyclopedia of the knowledge and the rituals that the dead pharaoh would need to navigate the underworld and to achieve eternal life. No earlier tomb had attempted this level of theological comprehensiveness, and the ambition of the attempt tells us something important about Seti's character and about his understanding of his own position in the history of the pharaonic state. Seti I was not merely building an elaborate tomb for his physical remains. He was building a theological monument, a comprehensive and exhaustive statement about the relationship between the pharaoh and the divine order, between death and eternal life, between the temporary world of the living and the permanent world of the gods. The ambition was not merely personal, it was institutional, a declaration that the new dynasty possessed the theological authority and the artistic capacity to create something that surpassed everything that had come before. The 18th Dynasty tombs had typically used a single funerary text, or at most two or three, as the basis for their decorative programs, and the coverage of the tomb surfaces was often incomplete. Seti's tomb was the first to attempt a comprehensive treatment, and the ambition of the attempt is itself evidence of the pharaoh's unprecedented artistic vision, his comprehensive theological ambition, and the extraordinary material and human resources that he was willing to devote to the creation of his eternal resting place. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that makes the story of KV-17 not merely a story of artistic achievement, but a story of loss, damage, and the terrible cost that the passage of time and the actions of human beings have inflicted on one of the greatest works of art in the history of human civilization. The tomb that Belzoni discovered in 1817 was, by his own account, in almost perfect condition, the colors vivid, the relief sharp, the surfaces clean. But the tomb would not remain in almost perfect condition for much longer. The discovery itself began the slow, progressive, and ultimately devastating process of destruction that would transform one of the greatest works of art in human history into a diminished and fragmented remnant of its former glory. The irony is profound. The tomb had survived 3,000 years in the sealed darkness of the Theban hills, its colours preserved by the remarkably stable temperature, the consistently low humidity, and the thoroughly dry atmosphere of the underground environment. The moment Belzoni opened the tomb, he introduced the two forces that would do more damage to the decoration than 3 millennia of natural processes had done: air and people. The fresh air that entered the tomb altered the temperature and the humidity of the chambers. The visitors who followed Belzoni brought with them moisture, body heat, carbon dioxide, and the physical contact that would gradually but inexorably degrade the painted surfaces that had survived in near-perfect condition for 32 centuries. The discovery itself began the process of destruction. Belzoni removed the sarcophagus. The magnificent alabaster sarcophagus is one of the most extraordinary, most technically accomplished, and most aesthetically stunning objects in the entire archaeological record of ancient Egypt. A coffin painstakingly carved from a single enormous and remarkably flawless piece of translucent Egyptian calcite, measuring approximately 2.8 meters in length and approximately 1 meter in width, decorated on every exterior and interior surface with scenes and texts from the Book of Gates. The translucency of the calcite is one of the sarcophagus's most remarkable features. When lit from within, the stone glows with a warm golden light. The intricately carved figures and meticulously inscribed hieroglyphic texts becoming magically visible through the translucent stone, as if illuminated by a fire burning inside the coffin itself. The effect was deliberate. The translucent stone was chosen specifically because it allowed the light of the funerary lamps to penetrate the walls of the sarcophagus and to illuminate the sacred texts, creating a visible, tangible, physically perceptible, and theologically deeply significant demonstration of the sun's light penetrating the darkness of the tomb and of the divine radiance that sustained the pharaoh's vulnerable soul during its dangerous passage through the underworld. On the interior base of the sarcophagus, the figure of the great sky goddess Nut stretches from one end of the sarcophagus to the other, her arms outstretched in a gesture of eternal embrace and eternal protection, her body arching over the space where the pharaoh's mummy would lie. A visual representation of the sky goddess enveloping the dead king, protecting him, and carrying him through the night toward the rebirth of the dawn. The magnificent alabaster coffin, carved from a single piece of translucent calcite, decorated on every surface with scenes from the Book of Gates, with the elongated, gracefully rendered figure of the sky goddess, Nut on the interior base, her arms outstretched in an eternal gesture of protection, was transported from the tomb, shipped to England, and offered for sale to the British Museum and the Louvre. Both of Europe's most prestigious cultural institutions regrettably declined to purchase it. The British Museum because it could not afford the asking price, and the Louvre because the French government was unwilling to allocate the necessary funds. The refusal of the two greatest museums in Europe to acquire one of the most extraordinary objects in the history of Egyptian art is itself a revealing episode, a reminder that the evaluation of ancient artifacts by modern institutions is subject to budgetary constraints, bureaucratic politics, and the vagaries of institutional taste and priorities. The sarcophagus was eventually acquired by the architect Sir John Soane, in whose London museum it remains to this day. One of the most extraordinary objects in any museum in the world, a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship, separated by more than 10,000 kilometers of land and sea from the underground burial chamber in the Valley of the King in which it was designed and intended to rest, undisturbed and inviolate for all of eternity. And it gets worse. The story of the progressive damage to KV-17 is one of the most depressing chapters in the history of archaeological conservation. A story of negligence, greed, and institutional failure that transformed one of the greatest works of art in human history into a disturbing and historically significant cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of treating the irreplaceable treasures of the past as commodities to be extracted, traded, and displayed rather than a trust. The damage began almost immediately after the discovery. Belzoni himself, though genuinely awed by the beauty of the tomb, was also a product of his era. An era in which the archaeological excavation and exploration of ancient sites was frequently and unashamedly driven as much by the desire for portable antiquities as by the disciplined pursuit of historical knowledge and the systematic recovery of the past. Belzoni's removal of the sarcophagus, however carefully it was executed, was the first major, most visible, and most consequential act of physical removal from the tomb, and it set a precedent that subsequent visitors would follow with increasing enthusiasm and decreasing sensitivity. The sarcophagus was the most valuable single object in the tomb, but it was also an integral part of the tomb's design, the focal point of the burial chamber, the container for which the entire 137-meter descent into the earth had been constructed. Its physical removal from the tomb was not merely the simple loss of a single object. It was the dismemberment of a work of art, the separation of a part from the whole that it was designed to serve, and that gave it meaning. The tomb that Belzoni had found in such magnificent condition was progressively damaged by the visitors and the scholars who followed him. Jean-François Champollion, the legendary French scholar who had deciphered the Rosetta Stone and who had thereby opened the entire vast and endlessly productive field of Egyptological research and discovery, visited the tomb during his expedition of 1828 to 1829 and removed a wall panel from one of the corridors. A German research team visited in 1845 and removed additional wall paintings. Other visitors, tourists, scholars, adventurers, and souvenir hunters, chipped pieces from the reliefs, touched the painted surfaces, left graffiti on the walls, and caused damage that accumulated over the decades until the tomb was so severely, so extensively, and so irreversibly compromised by accumulated damage that the Egyptian Antiquities authorities were forced to close it to the general public for the foreseeable future, restricting access to only those conservators and scholars whose work required direct contact with the fragile surfaces. The beautiful images that were stolen from the tomb's walls are now parts of museum collections in Berlin, Paris, Florence, and other cities. Fragments of a masterpiece scattered across the museums of Europe, separated from their context and from each other, each one a piece of a magnificently coherent theological and artistic puzzle that can never, short of an act of international cooperation and cultural restitution that seems at present impossibly remote, be reassembled into the unified whole that the artisans intended. The mummy of Seti I was not found in the tomb. The sarcophagus that Belzoni removed had been empty. The pharaoh's carefully mummified body had been removed at some unknown and unrecorded point in deep antiquity, either by tomb robbers or by the priests of the 21st Dynasty, who organized the transfer of royal mummies from their original tombs to the hidden cache at Deir el-Bahari. The mummy was finally discovered in 1881 when the French Egyptologist Émile Brugsch entered the cache known as DB 320, a concealed tomb in the cliffs above the temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari that had been used by the priests of the 21st Dynasty to hide more than 50 royal mummies from the tomb robbers who were systematically plundering the Valley of the Kings. The discovery of the Deir el-Bahari cache was one of the most dramatic and most consequential events in the history of Egyptology, a moment when the actual physical bodies of many of the greatest and most historically significant pharaohs in Egyptian history were recovered from the obscurity of a hidden tomb and restored to the light of modern scholarship. The cache had been known to a local family, the Abd el-Rasul brothers of the village of Gurna, who had been secretly removing artifacts from the tomb and selling them on the antiquities market for years. The Egyptian authorities became suspicious when a series of rare and obviously ancient artifacts began appearing in the markets of Luxor and Cairo, and an investigation led to the discovery of the cache and its official clearance by Émile Brugsch in the summer of 1881. The scene that Brugsch encountered when he descended into the cache was one of the most extraordinary in the history of archaeology. The small, hidden tomb, originally constructed for a non-royal individual and later repurposed by the priests of the 21st Dynasty as a hiding place for the royal mummies, contained the bodies of more than 50 pharaohs, queens, and other royal family members, their coffins stacked and crammed into the severely limited and increasingly cramped space of the underground chambers, their carefully mummified bodies wrapped in layer upon layer of linen, their names inscribed on the wrappings by the priests who had moved them. The mummies had been transferred to the cache over a period of decades, rescued from their original tombs in the Valley of the Kings by priests, who understood that the tombs were no longer safe from the robbers who were systematically plundering the necropolis. Among the mummies in the cache were those of Ramesses II, Thutmose III, Ahmose I, and Seti I himself. Pharaohs of the Golden Age, the Revolution, and the Restoration, gathered together in a single hidden tomb, their bodies wrapped in carefully applied layers of linen, their faces set in the serene and timeless expressions of death, their names written on the wrappings by the priests who had moved them centuries after their original burials. The mummy of Seti I was, by all accounts, one of the best preserved in the cache. The face was serene, so well preserved that the head of the Cairo Museum famously remarked that Seti looked as if he would acknowledge a greeting with a smile. The head had been separated from the body by tomb robbers, but the preservation of the facial features was extraordinary, showing a man who appeared to be less than 40 years old at the time of his death. The cause of death was uncertain. There was no evidence of violence on the mummy, and modern medical analysis has suggested that Seti may have suffered from a vascular disease that caused his heart to malfunction. The death was unexpected, premature, and historically tragic, and the untimely passing of Seti I is one of the most consequential and most historically significant events in the history of the 19th Dynasty, because it cut short the reign of a pharaoh who was, by all measures, one of the most capable and most artistically visionary rulers in the history of the Egyptian state. If Seti had lived another 20 or 30 years, if he had been granted the kind of extended, productive, and historically consequential long reign that his son Ramesses would enjoy, the history of the 19th dynasty might have been significantly different. The military campaigns might have been more decisive. The artistic legacy might have been even more impressive. The institutional structures might have been more firmly established. The relationship with the Hittite Empire might have been resolved sooner and on more favourable terms. But Seti died young, his heart failing, his body succumbing to a vascular disease that modern medicine might have treated, but that the physicians of the 13th century BC could neither accurately diagnose nor effectively cure. The pharaoh who created the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings did not live to see the completion of all his projects, and the enormous and historically consequential work of completion fell to his son, the young and ambitious Ramesses, who would build on his father's foundations and who would, in the process, create one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of human civilization. The death was unexpected. The pharaoh was in the prime of his physical and intellectual powers. His ambitious and strategically consequential military campaigns in the Levant and Libya were ongoing and unfinished. His building projects were unfinished. And his son Ramesses, though already designated as the crown prince and co-regent, was still a young man. The death of Seti I was not the death of an old man who had completed his work. It was the death of a man who had more to do, more to build, more to conquer, and whose early passing left the completion of his vision to his son. The building program of Seti I, the program that produced the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings, extended far beyond KV-17. Seti was one of the most prolific builders of the 19th dynasty, and his architectural legacy includes some of the most impressive and most historically significant structures in the entire history of the pharaonic state. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos, the ancient sacred city in Upper Egypt that the Egyptians regarded as the burial place of Osiris, the god of the underworld and the king of the dead, is one of the finest temples in Egypt and one of the single most important, most archaeologically productive, and most theologically revealing sources of information about the religious beliefs, the ritual practices, and the historical consciousness of the 19th Dynasty. The temple was begun by Seti and completed by his son Ramesses II, who added the final decorative elements and inscribed the dedication texts. The reliefs in the temple are of an artistic quality that has led some scholars to describe them as the finest relief art ever produced in the entire history of ancient Egypt, an assessment that places them above even the reliefs in KV-17 and above the reliefs of any other temple or tomb in the archaeological record. The figures are carved with a delicacy of line that is almost unbelievable. The contours of the human body, the folds of the linen garments, the individual feathers of the divine headdresses, the intricate patterns of the sacred jewelry, all rendered with a precision and a sensitivity that speaks of artisans who had mastered their craft to a degree that is difficult for the modern observer to comprehend. The colours, where they survive, are subtle and harmonious, applied with a restraint and a sophistication that stands in marked contrast to the bolder, more vivid palette of the later Ramesses temples. The overall effect is one of quiet grandeur, a temple that speaks not with the thunderous voice of Ramesses, but with the measured, elegant, and supremely confident voice of a pharaoh, who understood that true magnificence does not require excess. The reliefs in the temple are of extraordinary quality. Some scholars consider them the finest reliefs ever produced in the entire 3,000-year history of Egyptian art, a judgment that is remarkable in its unanimity among the scholars who have studied the temple, and that reflects the extraordinary quality of the carving, the painting, and the compositional design of the scenes. The temple contains 7 sanctuaries dedicated to Osiris, Isis, Horus, Amun-Re, Re-Ptah, and Seti himself, each one decorated with scenes showing the pharaoh making offerings to the deity and receiving the deity's blessing in return. The scenes are carved in the sunken relief technique that Seti favoured, a technique in which the figures are cut into the surface of the stone rather than raised above it, and the quality of the cutting is so precise, so delicate, and so sensitively modelled that the carved figures seem to possess an almost miraculously three-dimensional quality, their forms emerging from the stone with a subtlety and a grace that is difficult to describe in words, and that must be seen to be fully appreciated. Some scholars have described the reliefs at Abydos as the Egyptian equivalent of the High Renaissance, the sublime and unrepeatable moment when a centuries-long, continuously evolving artistic tradition reached its fullest maturity, its most refined expression, and its most perfect synthesis of technique and vision. The reliefs in the temple are of extraordinary quality. Some scholars consider them the finest reliefs in all of Egypt, even more accomplished than the reliefs in KV-17, with a delicacy of line and a sensitivity of modelling that has never been surpassed. The Temple of Abydos contains one of the most historically significant objects in the entire archaeological record of ancient Egypt, the Abydos King List. This is a list of 76 pharaohs, carved in hieroglyphic cartouches on the wall of a corridor in the temple, running from the legendary rulers of the First Dynasty all the way forward to Seti himself. The list is one of the indispensable principal sources for the scholarly reconstruction of the complete Egyptian royal chronology. The sequence of pharaohs that forms the backbone of the historical study of ancient Egypt, and that has been the subject of scholarly debate since the earliest days of Egyptology. The Abydos king list is not the only ancient Egyptian king list. Other lists survive at Saqqara, at Karnak, and in the Turin Papyrus, but it is one of the most complete and the most carefully carved, and its prominent location in Seti's temple at Abydos gives it a particular significance as a deliberate, officially sanctioned, and publicly visible statement about the official version of Egyptian history. The scene in which the king list appears is itself revealing. It shows Seti I and the young Prince Ramesses, the future Ramesses the Great, still a boy at the time the scene was carved, standing before the long, carefully curated list of royal cartouches, making offerings to the spirits of the dead pharaohs whose names are inscribed on the wall. The scene is not merely historical, It is ritual, a visual representation of the ancient, venerable, and theologically essential act of ancestor worship that connected the living, reigning pharaoh to the long, illustrious line of his royal predecessors, and that established the continuity of the pharaonic institution across the centuries. By making offerings to the dead pharaohs, Seti was declaring himself their legitimate successor, the latest link in an unbroken chain of divine rulers that stretched back to the beginning of Egyptian history. The offering scene was also a profound declaration of political identity and dynastic legitimacy. By choosing which pharaohs to include and which to exclude, Seti was defining the official version of the past and was asserting his dynasty's place within that version. The list is one of the principal sources for the scholarly reconstruction of the complete Egyptian pharaonic chronology, the unbroken sequence of rulers and dynasties that forms the backbone of the historical and chronological study of ancient Egypt and its remarkable civilization. But the list is also one of the most politically revealing documents of the Ramesses period, because it deliberately omits certain pharaohs. Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, is not included. Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, is not included. Smenkhkare, Neferuaten, Tutankhamun and I, all the pharaohs of the Amarna period whose reigns Horemheb had erased, are not included. The Abydos king list is not merely a historical document, it is a political document, a carefully curated version of the past that reflects the ideological commitments of the present and that perpetuates the erasure that Horemheb had initiated a generation earlier. The omissions in the Abydos king list are significant because they reveal the extent to which the Ramesses dynasty, the dynasty that Seti's father had founded, and that Seti was in the process of consolidating, was committed to the version of history that Horemheb had constructed. The erasure of the Amarna pharaohs was not merely a personal vendetta by Horemheb, it was a state policy that was maintained and reinforced by his successors, a policy that reflected a genuine conviction that the Amarna period had been a catastrophe, that the pharaohs who had presided over it had been illegitimate, and that the historical record should reflect this judgment by excluding them from the official list of Egypt's rulers. The Abydos king list has been the subject of extensive scholarly debate, not merely for what it includes but for what it excludes, and for what the exclusions reveal about the political and theological assumptions of the Ramesses period. The exclusion of Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who had ruled Egypt with distinction for more than 2 decades during the 18th dynasty, reflects the Ramesses conviction that the pharaonic office was fundamentally male, and that the reign of a female pharaoh was, by definition, illegitimate and unworthy of commemoration. The exclusion of the Amarna pharaohs, Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Neferuaten, Tutankhamun, and I, reflects the continuation of the damnatio memoriae that Horemheb had initiated and that the 19th dynasty had adopted as official state policy. The exclusions are not accidental, they are deliberate, calculated, and theologically motivated acts of historical editing that reflect the values and the assumptions of the men who compiled the list and that serve the political interests of the dynasty that commissioned it. Seti's decision to include the king list in his temple at Abydos was not merely an act of historical preservation. It was a profoundly consequential act of historical editing, a deliberate and carefully considered declaration of which pharaohs counted and were deemed worthy of commemoration, and which did not, which reigns were legitimate and which were not, which chapters of the past deserved to be remembered and which deserved to be forgotten. The great hypostyle hall at Karnak, one of the most impressive architectural spaces in the history of human civilization, was begun by Seti I and completed by his son Ramesses II. The hall covers an area of approximately 5,000 square meters, larger than many European cathedrals, and contains 134 massive sandstone columns arranged in 16 rows. The central 12 columns are approximately 23 meters tall and 3.5 meters in diameter, topped with open papyrus capitals that support the ceiling of the central nave. The remaining 122 columns are approximately 15 meters tall, topped with closed papyrus bud capitals. The entire surface of every column, every wall, every architrave is covered in carved relief, Scenes of the pharaoh making offerings to the gods, scenes of military triumph, scenes of religious ritual and theological declaration. The north wall of the hypostyle hall, the wall that Seti personally commissioned and supervised the decoration of, contains the monumental, dramatically composed, and artistically extraordinary reliefs depicting his military campaigns in the Levant, scenes of battle and conquest that are among the most impressive examples of military art in the ancient world. The construction of the hypostyle hall was one of the most ambitious, most logistically demanding, most organizationally complex, and most architecturally impressive construction projects in the entire history of the ancient world, requiring the quarrying, transportation, and precise placement of thousands of tons of sandstone, the coordination of hundreds of skilled laborers and craftsmen, and the engineering expertise to erect columns of extraordinary height and weight on foundations that would support them for millennia. The project was not completed during Seti's reign. The southern portion of the hall, including many of the smaller columns and much of the interior decoration, was completed by Ramesses II, who added his own inscriptions and his own decorative program to the structure that his father had begun. The north wall, the wall that Seti decorated with his battle scenes, is Seti's work, and its reliefs are generally considered to be artistically superior to the reliefs on the south wall that Ramesses added. The contrast between the father's refined, delicate relief work and the son's bolder, more deeply cut, and less subtly modelled reliefs is immediately visible to even the casual modern visitor, and has been the subject of extensive, detailed, and frequently passionate scholarly comment and discussion. The scale of the hypostyle hall is difficult to comprehend from written descriptions. It must be physically experienced, walked through, and directly encountered to be even partially understood and appreciated. The engineering of the hall is as impressive as its aesthetics. The central columns, each one carved from a single block of sandstone, each one weighing approximately 65 tons, each one raised to a height of approximately 23 meters, required an extraordinary feat of quarrying, transportation, and erection that taxed the logistical capabilities of the Egyptian state to their limits. The columns were quarried at Gebel el-Silsila, transported by barge on the Nile to Thebes, and raised into position using ramps, levers, and the coordinated labor of hundreds of workers. The precision of the construction is remarkable. The enormous columns are aligned with a geometric accuracy and a precision of placement that modern structural engineers find genuinely impressive and technically remarkable, and the joints between the individual drums that make up each column are so tight that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. The hall was designed to create the impression of walking through a primordial papyrus marsh. The swamp that the ancient Egyptians believed had existed at the very beginning of creation, at the primordial moment when the world first emerged from the waters of chaos, from which the first mound of earth had emerged, and on which the first temple had been built. The columns are the papyrus stalks, the ceiling is the sky. The hall is a recreation of the moment of creation, a theological statement rendered in stone and scale, a declaration that the temple of Amun at Karnak was not merely a building but a recreation of the cosmos itself, and that the pharaoh who built it and who dedicated it to the worship of Amun-Re was not merely a temporal ruler exercising political authority, but an active and divinely empowered participant in the sacred and cosmically significant act of creation itself. The artistic quality of Seti's reliefs, both in his tomb and in his temples, has been the subject of extensive scholarly comment, and the consensus is that Seti's reign represents the high point of Egyptian relief art, the moment when the technique reached its fullest development and its most refined expression. The scholar who has studied the art of the 19th Dynasty most closely has noted that Seti's reign saw military success as well as achieving one of the high points of Egyptian art, marked by sensitivity, balance, and restraint, qualities that were, in some ways, the opposite of the artistic tendencies of his son Ramesses, whose art was characterized by scale, repetition, and ostentation, rather than by the delicacy and the refinement that distinguish Seti's work. The artistic legacy of Seti I extends beyond his own buildings and his own tomb. It encompasses the entire aesthetic sensibility of the early 19th dynasty, a sensibility that was shaped by Seti's patronage and that reflected his personal taste and his personal vision of what Egyptian art should be. The art of Seti's reign has been described by scholars as the culmination of a tradition, the moment when the ancient and venerable Egyptian relief tradition, patiently and painstakingly developed and refined over the course of many centuries, reached its fullest expression and its most refined form. The reliefs of the 18th dynasty had been elegant but often schematic, following established formulas and conventional patterns. The reliefs of the later 19th dynasty, the reliefs of Ramesses II and his successors, would be bold and impressive but often coarser, sacrificing the delicacy and the subtlety of Seti's work for the scale and the repetition that Ramesses's monumental ambitions required. Seti's art occupies the rare and historically precious perfect middle ground. It has the sophistication and the refinement of the 18th dynasty tradition, but also the energy and the dynamism of the 19th dynasty aesthetic, combining the best qualities of both eras into a synthesis that is, by the consensus of art historians, the supreme achievement of the pharaonic art tradition. The contrast between father and son, between the artist and the self-promoter, between the man who built the most beautiful tomb in the valley and the man who would build the largest and the most numerous, is one of the most revealing and most humanly affecting contrasts in the history of the pharaonic state. The tomb itself, KV-17, was constructed by the artisans of Deir el-Medina over the course of Seti's reign, which lasted approximately 11 to 15 years. The workforce, quarrymen who carved the chambers from the living rock, draftsmen who laid out the preliminary drawings, sculptors who carved the reliefs, painters who applied the pigments, worked in shifts, descending into the growing tomb each day to continue the sacred and demanding work of creating the pharaoh's permanent and theologically essential eternal dwelling place. The artisans who created KV-17 were among the most skilled and most socially privileged workers in the Egyptian state, members of a hereditary community of craftsmen whose specialized knowledge was passed down from father to son across generations and whose social status, while not royal, was significantly higher than that of the ordinary Egyptian laborer. The artisans were organized into two teams, the right side and the left side, corresponding to the two sides of the tomb that they were responsible for decorating. Each team was led by an experienced foreman and included specialized draftsmen, expert sculptors, skilled painters, and supporting laborers, each one responsible for a specific, clearly defined, and technically specialized aspect of the complex and demanding work of creating a royal tomb. The teams worked in 8-day shifts, spending 8 days in the valley, living in temporary shelters near the entrance to the tomb, and then returning to their families in the village of Deir el-Medina for 2 days of rest. The workday was divided into 2 shifts, separated by a midday break, during which the artisans ate their meals and rested in the shade of the shelters. The organization of the workforce was precise, methodical, and thoroughly documented. The records of attendance, work assignments, and supply deliveries that have been recovered from Deir el-Medina provide an extraordinarily detailed picture of the labor that went into the creation of the royal tombs. The village of Deir el-Medina, where the artisans lived, has been extensively excavated and studied by Egyptologists, and the thousands of ostraca, inscribed limestone flakes, and pottery fragments that have been recovered from the village provide an extraordinary window into the daily lives, the working conditions, the social relationships, and the personal concerns of the men who created the royal tombs. The ostraca record complaints about late wages, disputes between neighbors, love poems, religious prayers, medical prescriptions, and official correspondence between the village and the central administration. A comprehensive and richly detailed record of working-class life in ancient Egypt that is unparalleled in the archaeological and historical literature of any ancient civilization. The conditions were harsh. The tomb was oppressively hot, stifling, virtually airless, and perpetually impenetrably dark, illuminated only by the light of oil lamps, whose smoke blackened the ceilings and whose flickering flames cast shadows that made the precision work of carving and painting extraordinarily difficult. The artisans worked with copper chisels, stone hammers, and brushes made from plant fibers, using pigments derived from minerals. Deep red from naturally occurring iron oxide, brilliant blue from carefully prepared copper compounds, yellow from arsenic sulfide, green from malachite, white from calcium carbonate, and black from carbon. The tunnel that descends from the burial chamber of KV-17 into the bedrock below is one of the most mysterious and most debated features of the tomb. The tunnel, discovered Belzoni, but never fully explored during his visit, extends for an unknown distance below the level of the burial chamber, descending at a steep angle into the rock. Various theories have been proposed to explain the tunnel's purpose. Some scholars have suggested that it was intended as a secondary burial shaft, others that it was designed to connect the tomb to the subterranean waters that the Egyptians believed flowed beneath the earth, and still others that it was an unfinished architectural element that was abandoned when Seti died before it could be completed. The tunnel remains partially unexplored, and its purpose remains uncertain. One of the many tantalizing and frustrating unresolved mysteries that the remarkable and endlessly fascinating tomb of Seti I continues to pose, with tantalizing persistence, to the scholars and archaeologists who study it. Recent exploration has revealed that the tunnel extends for at least an additional 100 meters beyond the point reached by previous investigators, making the total length of the tomb and its associated tunnel potentially more than 230 meters, a staggering distance that would make KV-17 the longest underground structure in the entire Valley of the Kings by a significant margin. The purpose of the tunnel remains the subject of active scholarly debate and ongoing exploration to the scholars who study it. The astronomical ceiling of the burial chamber is one of the most widely celebrated features of the entire tomb, and simultaneously one of the most scientifically significant for the history of astronomy and the history of art. The ceiling is painted with a representation of the northern sky, showing the constellations, the decans, the 36 star groups that the ancient Egyptians used to divide the night sky into measurable hours of darkness, and the figures of the celestial deities. The representation is rendered in deep blue and gold, with the figures of the constellations depicted as gods, goddesses, and sacred animals, a visual translation of the night sky into the language of Egyptian theology. The astronomical ceiling of KV-17 is the most complete and the most artistically accomplished of the astronomical ceilings in the Valley of the Kings, and it has been studied by astronomers and Egyptologists alike for the information it provides about the Egyptian understanding of the heavens and the intimate and profound relationship between careful celestial observation and deeply held religious belief in the ancient Egyptian worldview. And now we arrive at the question that the vivid colours and the carved reliefs and the astronomical ceiling and the translucent sarcophagus and the scattered wall panels and the serene face of the mummy all converge upon. The question that makes the story of Seti I and his tomb not merely a chapter in the history of art, but a meditation on the nature of beauty, permanence, and the terrible fragility of the things that human beings create to outlast themselves. Why did Seti build the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings? What was he trying to achieve? And did he achieve it? The answer is both simple and complex. The simple answer is theological. The tomb was, in the most literal and most theologically precise sense, a machine for achieving eternal life, a carefully designed and comprehensively decorated vessel that was intended to carry the pharaoh's imperiled and theologically precious soul through the manifold dangers of the underworld and into the eternal safety of the divine afterlife. Every scene, every text, every image on the tomb's walls served a specific theological function, providing the spells, the prayers, the knowledge, and the divine protection that the dead pharaoh would need to navigate the 12 hours of the night and to emerge, reborn, with the rising sun. The tomb was not decorative in the modern sense of the word. It was not designed to be admired by visitors or to serve as a showcase for artistic skill. It was functional, piece of sacred technology, a machine for achieving eternal life, a carefully engineered and comprehensively programmed vessel that was designed to carry the pharaoh's soul through the most dangerous journey that the Egyptian theological system could imagine. Every image served a purpose, every text performed a function, every color, every line, every carved surface was a component in a system of magical and theological protection that was designed to ensure that the dead pharaoh would successfully navigate the 12 hours of the night, that he would pass through the gates of the underworld without being destroyed by the serpent guardians, that he would be judged by Osiris and found worthy, and that he would emerge, reborn, with the rising sun, transformed from a dead human being into a living god, eternal, imperishable, and forever united with the solar deity, whose daily journey through the sky and the underworld was the central drama of the Egyptian theological imagination. The tomb was not decorative, it was functional, a piece of technology designed to accomplish the single most important, most urgent, and most theologically consequential tasks that the elaborate Egyptian funerary theological system could imagine or contemplate: the transformation of a dead human being into an eternal god. The complex answer is political and personal. Seti was the second pharaoh of a new dynasty, a dynasty that had been founded by his father, a commoner by birth, a professional military man by training, a man who had been appointed to the throne by the childless Horemheb rather than born to it. The 19th Dynasty needed to establish its legitimacy, to demonstrate to the priesthood, to the army, to the people of Egypt, and to the gods themselves, the divine powers who governed the cosmos and who conferred the authority to rule, that the Ramesses I pharaohs were not merely the politically appointed successors of a dying and exhausted dynasty, but the divinely chosen rulers of a new era. The tomb of Seti I was part of this project of legitimation, a visible, tangible, and overwhelmingly beautiful demonstration that the new dynasty possessed the resources, the artistic vision, and the theological authority to create something that surpassed everything that had come before. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the ancient Egyptians and their relationship with death. And the tomb of Seti I is the evidence. We assume that the ancient Egyptians were morbid, obsessed with death, preoccupied with the afterlife, spending their lives preparing for the end. The tomb of Seti tells a different story. The tomb is not a monument to death. It is a monument to life, to hope, to the fierce, unquenchable, and profoundly human desire to endure beyond the boundary of physical existence, to survive the death of the body, to maintain the identity of the self, to continue the journey of the soul past the point where the biological organism ceases to function. The colours on the walls of KV-17 are the colours of hope, not the pale, tentative hope of uncertainty, but the vivid, assertive, comprehensively documented hope of a civilization that had spent 3,000 years developing and refining a comprehensive and meticulously developed technology of salvation, a system of beliefs, practices, and artistic traditions that was designed to guarantee the pharaoh's passage from the world of the living to the world of the eternal and the divine. The ancient Egyptians did not merely hope for an afterlife. They engineered it. They built tombs. They mummified bodies. They inscribed spells. They painted ceilings with maps of the heavens. They carved sarcophagi from translucent stone. They created an entire infrastructure of eternity, a comprehensive, materially intensive, artistically sophisticated, and theologically rigorous system of preparation for the journey beyond death that was without parallel in the ancient world. And that remains, to this day, one of the most extraordinary intellectual, theological, and artistic achievements that the creative genius of the human species has ever produced. The tomb of Seti I is the supreme expression of this infrastructure of eternity, the moment when the resources, the artistic talent, the theological knowledge, and the institutional capacity of the Egyptian state were all brought to bear on a single project with a single purpose: the creation of a space so beautiful, so comprehensively decorated, so theologically comprehensive, and so artistically perfect that the pharaoh who was buried within it would be absolutely, unconditionally, irrevocably, and permanently guaranteed. Absolutely, permanently, and irrevocably guaranteed safe passage through the underworld and eternal life in the company of the gods. The ambition is breathtaking. The execution is flawless. And the result? The result is KV-17, the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the most comprehensively decorated royal burial in the history of the pharaonic state, the single most accomplished work of funerary art that the human species has ever produced. And that remains, to this day, one of the most extraordinary achievements of the human imagination. Every colour on the walls of KV-17 is an assertion of vitality. The deep blue of the sky, the gold of the sun, the green of the papyrus marshes, the red of the desert. Every figure is alive. The gods move, the pharaoh walks, the sacred animals watch and guard and protect. The tomb is not a place of endings. It is a place of beginnings, a threshold between two modes of existence, a gateway through which the dead pharaoh passes from the impermanent world of the living to the permanent world of the eternal, a celebration of the beauty and the richness and the inexhaustible creativity of the human capacity to imagine eternity and to render that imagination in stone and pigment and gold. The tomb is alive, alive with colour, alive with movement, alive with the figures of gods and goddesses who reach out from the walls in gestures of welcome and protection. The tomb is not a place of mourning. It is a place of hope, a place where the dead pharaoh's journey through the darkness was mapped and guided and illuminated by the most beautiful, the most theologically precise, and the most artistically accomplished funerary art that human hands and human imagination could produce. Let that sink in. The most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings was created not by despair but by hope, not by the fear of death but by the confidence that death could be overcome, that the darkness could be navigated, that the journey through the underworld could end in rebirth and renewal. The vivid colours, the blues that mirrored the sky, the golds that evoked the sun, the greens that recalled the fertile marshes of the Nile, the reds that symbolized the life-giving blood of the earth, the intricate carvings that depicted gods and pharaohs with a precision and a delicacy that has never been surpassed, the astronomical ceiling that mapped the heavens with a beauty and an accuracy that reflected centuries of celestial observation, the translucent sarcophagus that glowed with the inner light of the sun god's radiance. All of these were expressions of a civilization's profound and unshakable conviction that the boundary between life and death was permeable, that the journey of the soul did not end with the cessation of breath, and that the proper preparation, the proper spells, the proper rituals, the proper funerary texts, and above all the proper art, art of the highest quality, art that was worthy of the gods, art that met the divine standard of beauty and precision that the theological tradition demanded, could guarantee the pharaoh's safe, unimpeded, and theologically guaranteed passage from the temporary world of the living to the world of the eternal. This is not science fiction. This is the lived theology of a civilization that devoted more of its resources, more of its prodigious artistic talent, more of its considerable material wealth, and more of its formidable intellectual energy to the fundamental problem of death and its solution than any other civilization in the history of the human species. The tomb of Seti I is the supreme expression of that devotion, the historical moment when the material resources of the most powerful state in the ancient world, the artistic talent of the most skilled craftsman in the ancient world, and the theological vision of a pharaoh who understood, with rare clarity and depth, the relationship between beauty and eternity converged to produce something that transcended mere decoration and achieved the status of a genuine masterpiece, a work of art that speaks, with undimmed power and undiminished beauty, across 32 centuries of human history, with a power and a beauty that the passage of more than 3,000 years has diminished, degraded, and fragmented, but has not yet, not quite, not entirely destroyed. Let that sink in. The most beautiful tomb in the world was created by people who believe that beauty had the power to defeat death, that the quality of the art, the precision of the carving, the vividness of the colours, the comprehensiveness of the theological program could literally save the pharaoh's soul and guarantee his eternal existence. The tomb was not merely art, it was salvation. The brushstrokes were not merely aesthetic, they were magical. And the artists who worked in the darkness of the tomb, painting by lamplight, carving by the glow of oil flames, were not merely craftsmen, they were priests. performing a sacred act of creation that was designed to achieve the most important goal that the human imagination has ever conceived: the triumph of life over death, of permanence over impermanence, of light over darkness, of the enduring human spirit over the transient human body. The theological conviction that animated the creation of KV-17, the conviction that beauty could save the soul, that art could defeat death, that the quality and the comprehensiveness of the tomb's decoration were directly related to the pharaoh's chances of successfully and permanently achieving the supreme goal of eternal life in the company of the gods, is alien to the modern secular imagination, which regards art as a form of expression rather than a form of salvation, and which separates the aesthetic from the theological in ways that the ancient Egyptians would have found incomprehensible. For the Egyptians, beauty was not merely pleasant, it was powerful, a force that could accomplish real things in the real world and in the world beyond. The beauty of the tomb was not a luxury, it was a necessity, a precondition for the pharaoh's survival in the afterlife, as essential to his eternal existence as the mummification of his body and the performance of the funerary rituals. The artisans of Deir el-Medina, who carved and painted the walls of KV-17, were not merely producing decoration, they were producing salvation, creating the conditions under which the dead pharaoh's soul could survive the terrors of the underworld and achieve the rebirth that the Egyptian theological tradition promised to those who were properly prepared. The theological framework of the tomb is complex and comprehensive, drawing upon multiple funerary traditions, combining different textual and visual programs, and creating a synthesized theological environment that addresses every aspect of the pharaoh's journey through the underworld. The Book of Gates maps the journey through the 12 hours of the night. The Litany of Re identifies the pharaoh with the 75 forms of the solar deity. The Amduat describes the geography of the underworld. The Book of the Heavenly Cow narrates the mythological origins of death and the afterlife. Together, these texts create a comprehensive, internally consistent, and mutually self-reinforcing system of theological protection and magical defense. A system in which every danger is anticipated, every challenge is addressed, and every conceivable and theologically documented threat to the pharaoh's eternal existence is neutralized by the appropriate spell, prayer, or ritual. We have followed Seti from his birth in a military family to his death at an unexpectedly early age. From the son of a newly appointed pharaoh to the creator of the most beautiful tomb in the valley, of the kings, from the military commander who reopened the ways of Horus and captured Kadesh to the builder of the temple of Abydos and the initiator of the hypostyle hall at Karnak. We have seen the tomb, the 137-meter descent into the underworld, the vivid reliefs, the astronomical ceiling, the translucent sarcophagus. We have seen the damage, the removal of the sarcophagus, the stripping of the wall panels, the progressive deterioration caused by centuries of visitors and decades of neglect. And we have seen the mummy, the Serenphus, the unexpectedly young man, the body hidden by the priests of the 21st Dynasty in the Cache at Deir el-Bahari, and discovered in 1881 among the bodies of more than 50 other pharaohs and queens. What does this story mean? Not for the history of art, not for the study of Egyptology, but for the human beings who hear it 32 centuries after the last painter of Deir el-Medina laid down his brush of plant fibre, cleaned his pigments from his hands, extinguished his lamp, and climbed the steps out of the darkness of the tomb and into the sunlight of the Theban hills for the very last time, and the tomb was sealed. It means that beauty is fragile. The most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb that the explorer and adventurer Belzoni described, with characteristic enthusiasm and genuine awe, as the finest of all the pharaohs' burials, the tomb whose colours were so vivid that they looked freshly painted after 3,000 years, has been progressively damaged, stripped, and degraded by the very people who came to admire it. The sarcophagus is in London. The wall panels are in Berlin and Paris and Florence. The colours have faded. The reliefs have been chipped. The tomb is now almost always closed to the public. Its surface is too fragile to withstand the moisture and the heat that human visitors introduce into the sealed environment of the underground chambers. the masterpiece that the artisans of Deir el-Medina created to last for eternity, that they carved and painted and polished with the intention that it would endure forever, that it would survive the death of the Pharaoh who commissioned it, the death of the dynasty that built it, the death of the entire ancient Egyptian civilization itself, and the passage of more than 30 centuries of human history, and would continue to function as a sacred space for the Pharaoh's soul for all of time, has been diminished, compromised, and partially destroyed by the very people who recognized its value and who came, ostensibly, to study and to preserve it. The damage is cumulative. Each removal of a wall panel, each chip from a relief, each touch of a painted surface, each breath of moist air in a sealed chamber adds to the total, and the total, accumulated over 2 centuries of scholarly attention and touristic interest, has transformed a masterpiece in near-perfect condition into a masterpiece in damaged condition, a masterpiece whose most beautiful elements have been scattered across the museums of Europe, and whose remaining elements are slowly but inexorably deteriorating, despite the dedicated and scientifically rigorous best efforts of the conservators and restoration specialists who are now working to preserve what remains. The modern conservation effort, led by teams of Egyptian and international specialists who bring to the task the most advanced technologies of preservation and restoration available to the modern world, is a sustained and scientifically rigorous attempt to reverse, or at the very least to significantly slow, the accumulated damage that 2 centuries of exposure and human contact have inflicted on the tomb. The effort includes the stabilization of the painted surfaces, the consolidation of the carved reliefs, the control of the temperature and humidity within the tomb, and the restriction of public access to a level that the fragile environment can sustain. The work is painstaking, methodical, and technically demanding, requiring a combination of artistic sensitivity, scientific expertise, and respect for the ancient artisans whose work the conservators are trying to preserve. The conservation effort is itself a kind of act of faith, a belief that the extraordinary beauty and the profound historical significance of the tomb are worth preserving, that the effort and the expense of conservation are justified by the intrinsic value of the art and by the profound historical significance and the irreplaceable cultural value of the monument, and that the present generation has an obligation, a sacred, non-negotiable, and morally binding obligation, an obligation that is both moral and cultural and civilizational, to protect and to transmit to future generations the masterpiece that the ancient artisans created. The belief is shared by Egyptologists, conservators, and the Egyptian government, and it is a belief that, in its commitment to the preservation of beauty across time, echoes, in a secular key, the very conviction that motivated the ancient artisans who created the tomb. The conviction that beautiful things deserve to endure, that the mere passage of time, however inexorable it may be, should not be passively allowed to destroy what dedicated and talented human hands have created, and that the present owes the past the duty of protection and the future the gift of inheritance, not by the passage of time, not by the slow, patient, and ultimately implacable erosion of natural geological and atmospheric processes, but by the actions of human beings who professed to value what they were destroying. The irony is severe and instructive. The tomb robbers who plundered KV-17 in antiquity, who broke into the burial chamber, who stripped the mummy of its gold, who smashed the canopic equipment and scattered the funerary objects, damaged the tomb's contents, but left the tomb's magnificent painted and carved decoration largely intact and undamaged. The 19th century scholars and explorers who followed Belzoni, Champollion, the German team, the tourists, the souvenir hunters, damaged the decoration that the robbers had left untouched. The robbers stole the gold, the precious metals and the gemstones and the amulets that adorned the pharaoh's mummy and that filled the storage chambers of the tomb. The scholars stole the art, the carved reliefs and the painted panels and the hieroglyphic inscriptions that adorned the walls, the ceilings, the pillars, and the doorways of the corridors and the chambers. The robbers were motivated by greed. They took what they could sell. The scholars were motivated by knowledge. They took what they could study. but the effect was the same. The tomb was diminished, its integrity compromised, its comprehensiveness destroyed. The masterpiece that had been created as a unified, integrated, theologically coherent whole was broken into pieces, pieces that were scattered across the museums and the private collections of Europe, each one beautiful in itself, each one a fragment of something that was infinitely more beautiful when it was whole. The fragmentation of KV-17 is a metaphor for the fragmentation of the ancient world itself. The slow, inexorable, historically devastating, and humanly heartbreaking process by which the comprehensive, integrated, and theologically coherent civilization of ancient Egypt was broken into pieces by the passage of time, by the actions of invaders and conquerors, by the erosion of natural processes, and by the well-intentioned but ultimately destructive interventions of the modern scholars and explorers who came to recover the past, and who, in the process of recovering it, inevitably damaged it, and the net result, the cumulative effect of 3,000 years of robbery and 2 centuries of scholarship, is a tomb that is, tragically and irreversibly, a shadow, a fragment, and a diminished remnant of what it once was, a masterpiece in which the most beautiful elements have been removed, the most vivid colours have faded, and the most delicate surfaces have been scarred by the touch of hands that should have known better. The story of KV-17 is, in this sense, a cautionary tale, a reminder that the preservation of beauty is a responsibility, not a right, not an option, not a luxury, but a fundamental obligation that the present owes to the past and to the future. The artisans of Deir el-Medina created KV-17 with the intention that it would last forever. The scholars and explorers who discovered it had the opportunity to preserve it, or at least, to minimize the damage that discovery inevitably causes. They did not take that opportunity. They removed pieces, they shipped objects, they allowed tourists to enter and to touch and to damage and to degrade. And the result is a masterpiece that has been diminished. Not destroyed, not obliterated, but diminished, reduced from its original glory to a lesser version of itself, a version that is still beautiful, still extraordinary, still capable of inspiring awe and wonder. But that is no longer what it was, no longer what the artisans intended, no longer what Belzoni saw when he first descended into the darkness with his torch and beheld a world of colour and form and sacred beauty that had been sealed in the earth for 32 centuries, and that the act of archaeological discovery is always, inevitably and inescapably, to some significant degree, an act of irreversible destruction and permanent alteration. Every tomb that is opened is a tomb that is changed. Every surface that is exposed to air and light and moisture begins, from the moment of its exposure, the slow, inexorable, thermodynamically inevitable process of physical deterioration that will, if unchecked, eventually consume it entirely. The archaeologist's task, the task of recovering the past without destroying it, of uncovering the evidence without consuming it, of making the ancient world visible without making it vulnerable, is one of the most difficult and most morally consequential tasks that the modern world has undertaken. The story of KV-17 is also a story about the relationship between power and beauty, between the political authority that commands resources and the artistic achievement that those resources make possible. Seti was able to create the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings because he commanded the resources of the most powerful state in the ancient world. The quarrymen, the sculptors, the painters, the draftsmen, the gold, the pigments, the copper tools, the oil lamps, the food and water that sustained the workforce during the years of construction. Without the political authority of the pharaoh, the artistic achievement would have been impossible. No private individual, however wealthy, could have commanded the resources or coordinated the labor that the creation of KV-17 required. The beauty of the tomb is, in this sense, a product of power, the visible, tangible expression of the political authority that the pharaoh exercised, and of the economic resources that the Egyptian state controlled. But the relationship between power and beauty is not merely instrumental. It is also philosophical, a relationship that raises questions about the purpose of political authority and the obligations that power imposes on those who hold it. Seti used his power to create beauty, to commission works of art that would endure for millennia and that would testify across the centuries to the artistic genius, the theological sophistication, and the extraordinary creative ambition of the civilization that produced them. The decision to devote such extraordinary resources to the creation of a tomb, to invest the labor of hundreds of artisans over a period of years in the decoration of a space that would be sealed and invisible for eternity, was itself a statement about the pharaoh's values and about the values of the civilization he led. The investment was not economic. The tomb produced no revenue, no trade goods, no military advantage. The investment was theological and aesthetic, an investment in eternity, in beauty, in the conviction that the creation of beautiful things was not merely a luxury, not merely a display of wealth and power, but a sacred obligation, a fundamental expression of the divine order and a fundamental expression of the pharaoh's divine nature. But the story of Seti's tomb is also a story about the endurance of beauty, about the capacity of great art to survive, diminished but not destroyed, across the millennia. The tomb is damaged. This is the undeniable, the documented, and the historically painful truth, and the truth is profoundly painful for anyone who cares about the preservation of beauty and the integrity of the historical record. The sarcophagus is gone. Transported to England 2 centuries ago, housed in a London museum 10,000 kilometres from the tomb in which it was meant to rest for eternity. The wall panels that once graced the corridors have been removed, stripped from the stone by scholars and adventurers who prized the undeniable aesthetic beauty of the individual fragments without understanding that the true and essential beauty of the tomb lay not in its individual parts, however magnificent those parts might be, but in its architectural and theological wholeness, not in the individual images, but in the comprehensive, integrated, and theologically coherent program of decoration that connected every image to every other image, and that made the tomb a complete, integrated, theologically coherent work of art. The wall panels have been scattered, but the tomb is not dead, not yet, not quite, and perhaps not ever. The reliefs that remain on the walls, the figures of gods, the scenes of the underworld, the hieroglyphic texts that spell out the spells and the prayers of the funerary tradition, are still there, still visible, still legible to the scholars who descend into the tomb with their cameras and their conservation equipment and their patient determination to preserve what remains. The astronomical ceiling is still there, still blue, still gold, still showing the constellations and the decans of the ancient Egyptian night sky. The tomb is wounded, but it is alive. It is late. The Valley of the Kings is dark. The entrance to KV-17, the longest, the deepest, the most beautiful tomb in the valley, is sealed, its iron gate locked, its interior invisible to the world outside. The tourists are gone. The guides are gone. The archaeologists have put away their instruments and their notebooks and have returned to their hotels in Luxor across the river where the lights of the modern city reflect off the surface of the Nile. So here is the answer to the question we began with. Who was Seti I, and why does his tomb matter? He was a soldier's son who became a pharaoh, a man whose decidedly non-royal and genealogically undistinguished origins might have been a significant source of political weakness and dynastic vulnerability, but who transformed them through military achievement, architectural ambition, and artistic vision into a source of extraordinary strength and historical significance. The dynasty he belonged to, the 19th Dynasty, the illustrious and historically consequential dynasty of Ramesses, was only 1 generation old when Seti took the throne, and the legitimacy of the dynasty was not yet fully established. Seti's response to this challenge, the challenge of legitimizing a new dynasty, of establishing its authority, and of demonstrating its worthiness to hold the throne, was not defensive. It was assertive, ambitious, and supremely confident. He did not merely maintain the structures that Horemheb had created. He surpassed them, building bigger temples, fighting larger campaigns, and creating, in his tomb, a work of art that made the tombs of every previous pharaoh look modest by comparison. The quality was the argument. The beauty was the proof. The tomb was the demonstration that the 19th Dynasty was not merely a continuation of the old order, but a new beginning, a new standard, a new definition of what a pharaoh's legacy could be. He inherited a kingdom that had been weakened by decades of theological upheaval and political instability, and he strengthened it. Through military campaigns that reopened the trade routes and reasserted Egyptian authority in the Levant, through building projects that restored the temples and glorified the gods, through administrative competence that maintained the institutional structures that Horemheb had created, and through an artistic vision that produced the most beautiful tomb, the finest temple reliefs, and the most magnificent architectural space in the history of the pharaonic state. He was the father of Ramesses the Great, the pharaoh who would reign for more than 60 years, who would fight the famous battle at Kadesh, who would sign the peace treaty with the Hittites, who would build Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, and who would become the most universally famous, most widely recognized, and most enduringly celebrated pharaoh in the entire history of ancient Egypt. But the son's fame has, in many ways, overshadowed the father's achievement. Ramesses built bigger, incomparably, overwhelmingly, almost obsessively bigger, covering the landscape of Egypt with monuments of such scale and such profusion that his name became synonymous with the pharaonic institution itself. Seti built better, more carefully, more delicately, more beautifully, with an attention to artistic quality and theological precision that his son's prodigious output could never match. The distinction is not a criticism of Ramesses. The son's achievements were extraordinary by any standard. But the distinction is important because it points to something that the passage of time and the fame of the son have obscured. The father was the greater artist. The father created the more beautiful tomb. The father commissioned the finer reliefs. The father's vision of what Egyptian art could be, the vision embodied in the walls of KV-17 and in the corridors of the Temple of Abydos, represents the pinnacle of a tradition that his son's work, for all its scale, would never equal. Ramesses covered more surfaces with more images. Seti covered fewer surfaces with more beauty. The contrast is not merely artistic, it is philosophical, a contrast between two different understandings of what a pharaoh's legacy should be, the quantity and the scale of Ramesses's prodigious output versus the precision and the artistic quality of Seti's more restrained but infinitely more refined production. Ramesses built Abu Simbel, 4 colossal seated figures, each one more than 20 meters tall, carved from the living rock of a Nubian cliff face. Seti built the Temple of Abydos, smaller, more intimate, and decorated with reliefs that scholars consider the finest ever produced in Egypt. Ramesses built the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile, sprawling, monumental, and dominated by a colossal statue of the pharaoh that was, at the time of its erection, the largest freestanding stone statue in the world. Seti built KV-17, hidden underground, invisible to the world, and decorated with an artistic refinement that Ramesses's builders never attempted to match. The father built for eternity. The son built for posterity. The father's art was private, created for the gods and for the pharaoh's soul, sealed in the darkness of the tomb, never intended for human eyes. The son's art was public, created for the world, displayed on the surfaces of temples and colossi that were designed to be seen, admired, and remembered. The contrast is not merely stylistic, it is philosophical, reflecting two fundamentally different understandings of what art is for and what legacy means. The scale of the son versus the refinement of the father, the ostentation of the one versus the quiet, confident artistry of the other. The relationship between Seti's art and Ramesses's art is not merely a matter of personal style. It reflects a deeper transformation in the purpose and the function of Egyptian royal art that occurred at the transition between father and son. Under Seti, the art served a primarily and fundamentally theological function. It was designed to ensure the pharaoh's passage through the underworld, to establish his relationship with the gods, and to demonstrate the cosmic significance of the pharaonic institution. Under Ramesses, the art increasingly served a political function. It was designed to glorify the pharaoh, to intimidate his enemies, to impress his subjects, and to establish Ramesses's personal dominance over the physical and psychological landscape of Egypt. The shift was not absolute. Ramesses's art retained its theological dimensions, and Seti's art was not without political implications. But the emphasis changed, and the change is visible in the contrast between the refined, delicate, theologically focused reliefs of the father and the bold, colossal, politically assertive monuments of the son. The numbers are striking. Seti reigned for approximately 11 to 15 years. His magnificent tomb extends for 137 meters into the earth. His temple at Abydos contains the king list of 76 pharaohs. His hypostyle hall at Karnak covers 5,000 square meters and contains 134 columns. His mummy was hidden for approximately 3,000 years before being discovered in 1881. His sarcophagus has been in London for approximately 200 years. A translucent alabaster coffin, carved with the texts of the Book of Gates, glowing with a warm golden light when illuminated from within, sitting in the basement of a Georgian townhouse in Lincoln's Inn Fields, while the tomb from which it was taken stands empty in the darkness of the Theban hills, separated from the tomb in which it was meant to rest for eternity. The numbers tell the story of a man whose reign was brief, but whose achievements were vast. A man who packed more beauty, more military success, more architectural ambition, and more theological vision into 15 years than many pharaohs achieved in 60. The tomb is dark. The colours that Belzoni saw by torchlight in 1817, the vivid blues and golds and reds and greens that had survived 3,000 years in the sealed darkness of the Theban hills, are fainter now, diminished by 2 centuries of exposure and damage, but they are still there. The figures of the gods still move across the walls. Osiris still receives the dead pharaoh, Anubis still guides the soul, Hathor still welcomes the king. The astronomical ceiling still shows the stars, the constellations and the deacons of a sky that the artisans of Deir el-Medina painted in the darkness, working by lamplight, creating a heaven beneath the earth to guide their pharaoh through the night and into the dawn. The journey of the pharaoh through the underworld, the journey that the tomb was specifically, purposefully, and comprehensively built to facilitate, the journey that the reliefs and the texts and the spells and the prayers were designed to guide, is a journey that has never ended. The mummy lies in the Cairo Museum, separated from the tomb in which it was buried. The sarcophagus sits in London, separated from the mummy it was built to hold. The wall panels hang in museums across Europe, separated from the walls on which they were carved. The tomb itself sits in the darkness of the Valley of the Kings, its gate locked, its surfaces sealed against the visitors whose admiration has damaged, and whose touch has degraded the masterpiece that the artisans of Deir el-Medina created to last forever. The pharaoh's body is in one city, Cairo, where the mummy of Seti I lies in the controlled environment of a museum gallery, its serene face still showing the features that caused the head of the Cairo Museum to remark that the pharaoh looked as if he would acknowledge a greeting with a smile. His coffin is in another city, London, where the translucent alabaster sarcophagus sits in the basement of Sir John Soane's museum, its carved surfaces glowing with the warm golden light that the artisans of Deir el-Medina designed to evoke the radiance of the sun god in the darkness of the underworld. His tomb is in a third city, Luxor, where KV-17 descends 137 meters into the Theban bedrock, its painted corridors silent, its iron gate locked, its fragile surfaces sealed against the humidity and the heat and the touching hands that have damaged them over 2 centuries of discovery and visitation. The journey is not over. The pharaoh's sacred and cosmically significant passage from the temporary world of the living through the darkness of death and into the radiant realm of eternal existence, the journey that the tomb was built to facilitate, the journey that the Book of Gates and the Litany of Re and the Amduat were designed to guide, has been interrupted but not ended. The pieces are scattered, the body in Cairo, the coffin in London, the wall panels in Berlin and Paris and Florence, the tomb itself in the darkness of the Valley of the Kings. But the pieces still exist, still carry the images and the texts and the sacred formulas that were carved into them more than 3,000 years ago, still possess the power to move and to astonish anyone who encounters them in the museums and the galleries where they now reside. The masterpiece is fragmented, but it is not destroyed. The fragments endure, the colours persist, the carved lines retain their precision, The figures of the gods still reach out from the ancient stone in gestures of divine welcome, eternal protection, and sacred embrace. And the beauty, the extraordinary, heartbreaking, civilization-defining beauty that Seti's artisans created in the darkness of a tomb 3,000 years ago, survives, in its scattered and diminished form, as an enduring and deeply moving testament to the extraordinary human capacity for creation, for artistic excellence, for imagination, and for the stubborn, magnificent, and ultimately futile attempt to build something that will outlast the people who built it and the civilization that gave it birth. The masterpiece is fragmented, and the beauty, the extraordinary, heartbreaking, irreplaceable beauty that Seti's artisans created in the darkness of a tomb 3,000 years ago, endures, diminished but not destroyed, wounded but not dead, separated from itself but still, in its scattered fragments, still capable of taking the breath away from anyone who stands before any one of its pieces and recognizes, in the precision of a carved line, in the heart-stopping vividness of a single painted eye, the luminous, warm, golden translucency of an alabaster sarcophagus glowing softly in a London museum basement 10,000 kilometers from the tomb in which it was meant to rest, in the graceful, protective curve of a goddess's outstretched hand, the unmistakable trace of something that was made to be eternal, that was conceived and designed and executed with the explicit and unwavering intention of lasting forever, of surviving the death of the pharaoh, and the death of the dynasty, and the death of the civilization itself. And that, against all odds, against all the violence of robbers and scholars, and the slow erosion of time, against all damage, against all the violence of robbers and scholars and time, has very nearly succeeded.